primarily, especially the Portuguese, they hitting up South America primarily, and they hit up the Caribbean. Spain gets in on it as well. Spain kind of captures the whole Caribbean. And actually during that time, they referred to the Caribbean as the Spanish Lake because they had Central America, all the Caribbean islands. And while the Portuguese were holding down the eastern coast of South America, primarily what we know as Brazil, that was their colony, was what they established was Brazil, which is why Brazilians speak Portuguese to this day. So the slave trade actually started around the early 16th century. So around like 1520 something is when you start seeing the first Africans starting to legitimately being used as slave in what Europeans were calling the New World, which was North America and South America. A lot of times you're going over this, some people would think that why wouldn't you just utilize the indigenous people that already exist there? But you have to look at this as a global thing. The people of North America and South America and the Caribbean, they were isolated people that, you know, they had never had any real contact with Europeans, Asians, or Africans for that matter. So a major issue as far as that was when they came into contact with the Europeans, that they caught a lot of diseases from them, primarily smallpox, caught a lot of diseases from them, wiped them out completely. Like even within our own American history, we talk about the Native Americans and how white people or whatever committed genocide on the Native Americans, but in reality, it was disease was the primary killer of Native Americans or indigenous people back in that time. So when you have this issue, as they're establishing these colonies, they're gaining this wealth. They're building these plantations, let's say sugar plantations in South America or within the Caribbean. They need the labor to operate these plantations, these operations, so they can send this product back to Europe, gain their wealth. But like as I said, the native peoples didn't have the immunities to the diseases they were coming in contact with the Europeans, and so that is kind of what drove the idea. Because as I said, if you think about it as economics, like a business, I have a company, I have product over in this other country. I need to grow that product, but the working force I have there is not good enough. In this case, it's primarily health. Had a lot of rebellions from those people as well, because that is their native land. They are going to be more willing to resist being enslaved and overpowered by the incoming people. So an easy solve to that was Africa, because of the whole Europe, the close proximity of Europe, Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Asia. Our people had the immunities to those diseases. Now, they generally say that you know, Africans sold other Africans into slavery. You know, first we gotta attack that whole idea, because for one, even the term African that we use, like, people have to look at the world history through the lens of colonization of the planet. Back in those days, those people would have never referred to themselves as Africans. It was Europeans that were discovering the world and gave the names to these continents: continent of Africa, Europe, even though Europe is a peninsula, not a continent, but they make their own rules and then change them. Asia, North America, South America. Back in those days, they would have just referred to themselves as whatever group they were a part of, the Dinka, the Nua, whatever, the Moors. It was just whatever group they were. There was no all-encompassing, we're all Africans. But that's the dynamic that, you know, Europeans brought into the world, so it's kind of adopted by everyone.
So let me hold you up, because I don't want you to jump ahead. We're gonna walk that way, and we're gonna talk about the differences between the slavery and the history of this world prior to the transatlantic slave trade and what we know as chattel slavery. But I want to back up a little bit. I want to back up to Pope Nicholas V. who was the Catholic diarchy in the 15th century in Portuguese. He was the head honcho. He had to clear all things and sign off on documents when it came to bringing slaves in from a total different land. Part of his initiative was religion-based. He made a document saying that if you weren't a Christian, pagan, Muslim, etc., you were allowed to be a slave. And then, as you talked about, economics, as it became more and more profitable for everyone that didn't look a certain way to profit off one people that did look a certain way, mainly based off a country what we now know today as Angola, eventually getting colonized by the Portuguese. It advanced and it developed and evolved to 10 to 15 countries profiting off of just plain old race. So going back to that, we got going back to my notes. 100% slaves were given the option of freedom if they chose Christianity. And this is from 1505 to about 1585. So let's talk about that, the role of how we use religion to dignify and push towards our moral obligation, or not necessarily obligation, but our moral ignorance of slavery and how we made it okay.
Yeah. Now, yes, the Christian church has played a major role in the slave trade to begin with. Like even in the beginning, as you said, you had to have approval from the Pope essentially to do anything. And if you wanted that freedom, you had to accept it from you had to accept their religion. And that was real common in South America, a little bit in Central America, and in the Caribbean, a little bit. Where you really didn't see that was in America. And it's generally brought because of the type of Christianity that was used. You know, Catholicism falls under the Pope, and then Spain and the rest of them, they kind of fell under the Protestant religion. The thing that's different with America was America came primarily British colony. That's the Anglo-Saxon part of the Christian religion. And they are the ones, as far as American history is concerned, they're the ones that then decided that we're not letting this thing go. They're the ones that literally just decided that, you know, some of these things and these rules that we're going to go by, you know, that we see in the Old Testament, and some of the words that are supposedly said by Jesus, like, you know, slaves obey your masters and all that other stuff, telling the Jews who they can and cannot slave, the rules that they can have to enslave their fellow man. These are the things that in America they utilize to justify their treatment. You know, in the Bible, if for anyone that believes that book, in the Bible it says, you know, it says who you can enslave. You know, obviously, if we're talking about the Old Testament, we knew from the Old Testament, we know there's different rules of slavery for if you were a Jewish person enslaving a Jewish person. And we know there's a set of rules for if you're a Jewish person enslaving a non-Jewish person, which in them days has been the Gentile. And so we know, typically when we talk about the Jewish slavery from the Old Testament, they're getting into, basically it's kind of like indentured servitude. You had them for a certain amount of time, you let them go. You can trick them into being a slave forever by, you know, letting them get married, and then then you know, you can go free, but then you keep his wife, and then they can decide if they have kids, the kids are yours. But then the rules completely flip when you're talking about non-Jewish slaves. That's where you come into the rules of you can beat them if they don't die within a couple of days, you're fine. If they do die, then whatever and whatever. And essentially the British, in the British colonies, if we're going back going back to those times, they just utilized the worst of these things because at the end of the day, like they knew that these were human beings that we're dealing with. But you have that what they call it, cognitive dissonance of when you're doing something that you know is immoral, but you're doing it anyway. So you then have to come up with ideas, strategies, ideologies to justify it to yourself to clear your mind. There's a psychologist. Her name is I forgot her name, but she does a speech and a talk that she does called PTSD, or post traumatic slave syndrome is what she calls it. And she runs through this stuff going all the way back to the slave days into the civil rights era, Reconstruction era, and everything about the mentality of the people that were engaging in these things and how they utilize religion to accomplish these things. Even the idea of ensuring your slaves adapted that religion. You know, they ensured that the enslaved adapted that religion, but then they turned around and made sure that the slaves, I'm gonna quit saying slaves, the enslaved Americans, they only focused on certain aspects of it, which is generally the turn the other cheek, you know, love thy neighbors, you love yours, whatever, all the little nice, forgiving stuff and all that. That, you know, they didn't allow them to be studying really the revolutionary type words that are within the Bible. I mean, the biggest example of that would be Nat Turner. You know, he was heavy into that religion, followed it 100%. Some things happened in his life, and he started questioning it and read other parts of the Bible. When he read other parts of the Bible, he took those words, eye for an eye. He took those words to heart, and then, you know, he started his own insurrection, killed a bunch of people, was free for a couple of days, and then, you know, they caught him, and history is what it is. But, you know, that book, you know, I don't want to get too crazy.
No, we ain't
on it.
We're gonna say
Yeah.
that. We're gonna say that for
book,
another episode.
That book has been the cause of a lot of heartache when it comes to African people.
Yeah, that's another episode. We just wanted to hit wave tops for right now.
Yeah.
But moving on into something that you were leading into, I keep hearing this idea, and I've heard it time and time again. This statement of, well, Africans own slaves, and Africans sold slaves to Europeans.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this whole slavery difference between the slavery in the history of the world, going all the way back to earlier, you know, 2000, 3000 BC.
Yeah, I mean, slavery is something that's always existed, and then that's another thing you have to even have a conversation about. What do you mean when you say slavery? Because there's many forms that can take. Slavery, basically for the existence of human beings and warring tribes throughout history, has always existed. You know, it was primarily a source of, we went to war with these people, we beat them, we enslaved them. But in general, that form of slavery was more like indentured servitude. You utilized them to do work around, like say if you're talking about during the times of the Roman Empire, they caught their people. They still had kind of autonomy. They weren't straight up slaves. They could still have their own belongings and their own personal things going on, and they can work their way out of that system. A lot of the other forms of slavery existed for a longer period of time than the transatlantic slave trade. The thing that makes the transatlantic slave trade different is the brutality of it, and it was solely for economic purpose. By them establishing these colonies in the new territories of North America, South America, and the Caribbean, that created a need, essentially created an industry to where now you need these people. So now you go into the Africans, who are, as I said before, they're just tribes doing whatever. And they had already have been dealing with each other, some warring, some not, and they'd already been dealing with the Europeans, trading this, trading that. So when it first starts out, it's more like because you got to remember, technologically, the Europeans were more advanced than the Africans. So, you know, the Europeans need a few people, If you're a warring tribe, you have some of your enemy, you don't sell them. What do you get in return? You can get guns, you can get whatever to help you fortify your own place. And that's how it's a trade. But what they had going on is their idea of slavery or indentured servitude is completely different from what they were selling people into.
Facts. You're talking about these individuals rarely ever left their region of where they lived. They rarely ever had their families separated. If they were enslaved, they were enslaved as a family. And again, I'm not justifying slavery. It's all bad, but we have to understand that we are talking about two totally different dynamics, and why the African people, the West African people, kind of were freely giving their people away or trading their people away, like you said, because they didn't understand the dynamic of what was going on and what was going to be going on. And in many cases, you were not destined to be a slave for the rest of your life. In many cases. In many cases, you eventually got your freedom. In many cases, if your children were born or if you had children born into servitude, they also potentially, did not stay slaves. So the dynamic of me taking you thousands of miles across the ocean, I'm stripping you of your language, I'm stripping you of your family, I'm stripping you of your God, I'm stripping you of your culture, I'm stripping you of every single thing you know and every single thing you were born to understand, and putting you in a place that is complete different. That is a whole social psycho dynamic that it puts those two type of slaveries on two different echelons.
Oh yeah, it's not even it's not even close. It's kind of like it's one of those things of what we know is typical in this country of the majority group in little ways trying to rewrite history or downplay the history from what it really is. I say, oh well, the Africans did that to themselves. Yes, but they didn't really know what they were doing. No one on the planet had ever done anything like that. No, there was never an industry of slavery established anywhere. Slavery was a byproduct of war and conflict, not just something you went, oh, let me go find these people and make them slaves. That's something the Europeans established with the transatlantic slave trade. It in itself became an industry. And that, just like a lot of our history here in America, it's a reality that people they'll have to get used to it. It's ugly, it's horrible, but you have to get used to it. You can't tiptoe around the facts. The facts are the facts.
So let's roll through in our timeline. Let's go to 1712. In 1712, an individual named Willie Lynch on the coast of Virginia read a letter, and he was invited to read this letter. People don't know he was a British slave owner off the Virgin Islands, so he wasn't American. However, he was known to have great success. The reason why he was asked to come and his help was sought out because, again, information that many people do not know. Many slaves were not willingly slaves. Rebellions happened. People fought back. And in this time, the 1700s, there was a rash of rebellions. So these slave owners reached out to Willie Lynch for his guidance and what he instituted for his slaves. If you want to talk about that.
Yeah, the Willie Lynch letter is pretty crazy. It's pretty graphic with how in detail it was. I mean, I couldn't imagine treating people like that. Even people that I would, I don't even think I could ever get to a point mentally where I could ever treat somebody that way. He's talking about taking the strongest male, beating him within an inch of their life in front of everybody else. So everyone else knows that this is the punishment for what happens if you act out of line. talking about separating the mother from the father, killing that relationship. A lot of these things are still aspects of the community today that is just crazy. Like when I came across that letter, I shouldn't say come across because I really sought it out, but it was about 2 years ago. I'd always heard about the Willie Lynch letter, never really delved into it. But you hear a lot of people, like say within the Black consciousness movement, a lot of the leaders that you mentioned earlier talk about it. But it was one of those I was like, I'd been reading a few books, like White Rage, What's the Matter with White People, and a few other books, and I was like, you know what? Let me read the Willie Lynch. Read it, and it was just crazy. It was so total, and you literally can see how what he told them to do is exactly what slavery ended up becoming in the South. Just straight brutality in all shapes, forms, and fashions.
I got an excerpt from the letter. I think it's pretty good to read. So I have outlined a number of differences among the slaves, and I take these differences and make them bigger. I use fear, distrust, and envy for control purposes. These methods have worked on my modest plantation in the West Indies, and it will work throughout the South. Take this simple list of differences and think about them. On top of my list is age, but it's only there because it starts with an A. The second is color or shade. There is intelligence, size, sex, sizes of plantation, status on plantation, attitude of owners, whether the slaves live in valley, on a hill, east, west, north, south, have fine hair, coarse hair, or is tall or short. Now that you have a list of differences, I shall give you an outline of action. But before that, I shall assure that distrust is stronger than trust and envy stronger than adulation, respect, or admiration. The Black slave receiving this indoctrination shall carry on and will become self-refueling and self-generating for hundreds of years, maybe thousands. Don't forget, you pitch the old black male versus the young black male and the young black male against the old black male. You must see the dark-skinned slaves versus the light-skinned slaves, the light-skinned slaves versus the dark-skinned slaves. You must see the female versus the male and the male versus the female. You must also have a white overseer who distrusts all blacks, but it is necessary that your slaves trust and depend on us. They must love, respect, and trust only us. Gentlemen, these kits are keys to control. Use them. Have your wives and children use them. Never miss an opportunity. If used intensely for 1 year, the slaves themselves remain perpetually distrustful. Thank you.
It's crazy. I mean, for anyone that's Black should read that and understand. I mean, like you said, that's just an excerpt. You should read. Anyone that's Black should read that letter and how total his methods were in breaking down anything, destroying any kind of unity that the slaves could build among each other, any kind of trust they could have among each other, anything. It's just so total. Like I was so pissed when I read that letter.
And I think what's important that we must convey to whoever we can, whether it's people we consider friends or whether it's our children or whoever, that this still vibrates on a wavelength into who we are. It is still deep in our fabric of ourselves. We still don't like each other for simple things such as skin color or type of hair or, who's rich and who's poor. It still is deep within our fabric. And it's very unfortunate. And we have to use this document and learn about this document. That way we very, very, very harshly rebel against it 300 years later. It's ridiculous. But I see so many examples that I can point to that revert back to the Willie Lynch experiment.
Yes, I mean, like white supremacy, white ideology, and all of these things. Like even when you bring up the letter, we bring up the letter. Like these aren't things that it's not just the letter that happened a couple hundred years ago. This is a tactic, an ideology, a lifestyle that was pushed on our people for hundreds of years, even to the modern time, where a lot of these same ideas are utilized in media, are pushed in media. And then that's how these things become the stereotypes. It's through what happens in media in modern times, the stereotypes that they push on us, the what's that? I forgot the name of it. What's that movie from the early 1900s that was about like the rise of the KKK? You know what I'm talking about? Where they had the white people in blackface and all that other stuff. I forgot what the name of it was.
I'm not sure.
What was it? Some American Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, that was it.
Yeah,
Birth of a Nation. Even a lot of the stereotypes, which a lot of people don't know, even a lot of stereotypes that are pushed on black people, as far as nationally, originate from that video. The whole idea of that black men are sex crazed. We want to go after white women. We like watermelon. A lot of those are stereotypes that they say about us originate from that movie. And in the modern time, it's so much harder I would say it's basically impossible to let go of some of the things that you learn from media that still persist. Like you're talking about the colorism thing, about being, whatever, however, if you're dark skinned, that's somehow supposed to be worse. And it don't matter how woke you are now, I'm pretty sure for every black person at some point in our lives, that was like a thing. Like you made fun of someone that was dark skinned. And if you were bright skinned, you felt like you looked better than someone that was dark skinned. Like I remember me when I was younger, like I was crazy bright skinned. Like you seen my kids, like I was brighter than them. And I remember hating summer because I knew in the summer months I was gonna get darker. And I hated it. So, as you come into your own, you start learning real story, real history of the people, those things change and you learn how to let those things go. But that is something that's being pushed on us every day. And by us, I'm not just talking about black people, I'm talking about everybody in the country, everybody in the world that even pays attention to Western media. That's something that's pushed on us every second of the day, every commercial you watch, every movie you watch, all the time, is these ideas about, any representation of black people for the most part in a movie is going to be, he's a criminal, he's a thug, he's ghetto, he's hood, he's this. Unless, you can go see like a black movie, and then you might see a more equal representation. You'll see the negatives, but you'll see the positives as well. But that's how we're portrayed, or we're portrayed as athletes, and we can't do nothing but athletics. They don't really do anything about the brain power of our people. Within American history, they'll talk about George Washington Carver, and they tell us, oh, he created peanut butter, but they don't go over the thousands of other inventions he had. So to most black people, say George Washington Carver, oh, that's the guy that created peanut butter. Like, yes, that's what he's most known for. That's what they tell us, but that's not it. Kind of like, it's just a hijacking of our history. It's kind of like with Martin Luther King. They tell us all the time, Martin Luther King had a dream. Martin Luther King had a dream. They done hijacked our leader and made us think he was a dreamer. They won't tell us about the revolutionary mindset he started getting after the March on Washington. They don't tell us that the Southern Christian Council turned their back on him after the March on Washington, because he started going after talking about stuff about economics. He was in Memphis when he got assassinated because of the sanitation workers and labor disputes. They don't want you to know that. Any idea of any leader of ours that was, in today's time, any leader that would buck the system, they don't want you to know nothing about that. They ain't gonna tell you about Marcus Garvey. We already know what they say about Malcolm X. We already know what they did to the Panthers. MLK is the only one that they'll push out there because he spoke peace, nonviolence, and all that other stuff. But they let it stop at that "I have a dream" speech. They don't say him and Malcolm were starting to become seeing eye to eye with a lot of their ideas.
So rolling. 1712. Obviously, hundreds of years of horrible, horrible slavery existed. We're going to dive into that on another episode, but we're going to jump to 1861. That is the growing disagreement between the North and the South over economic interest. It was a little bit about people in the North kind of felt sorry for slaves, but it was not a lot of it about that. That was kind of the thing that they used to push it to the people to get support publicly. However, there was very, very strong economic interest, and there was a lot of fear that the Southern slave owners, the elite, were going to push slavery to the new Western territories. Texas has been purchased in this time frame. Obviously, Louisiana and a few other places out west. We're moving out to California and all these new territories. If they can bring slaves out west, the South dominates the popular vote. The North, who are Republicans at the time, will pretty much have no say-so in the future of the American society. Soon after that, Abraham Lincoln, again, Republican, which we'll probably touch on that a little bit, the difference in the parties and how they changed, because I've seen this used a lot of times about how the Republicans fought against slavery and they were the good old guys that loved black people.
Yeah.
We'll get to that. So Abraham Lincoln, he understood these things. Boom, Civil War kicks off. So again, why did the South make it such a big deal to secede, and why were they willing to go to war over the rights to own slaves and what they coined at the time, states' rights, which that's a phrase still used today. States'
rights to own and maintain slavery. Yeah, states' rights. We get it. I mean, during that time period, you had the abolitionist movement that was growing. Also, you got to remember at that same time period, the Republican Party was a new party that had just come onto the scene. That wasn't just a thing; they had just come onto the scene. And once again, as I said, you got to think about these things as economics. Because of the abolition movement, which was primarily in the North. The word is going around that we need to start getting rid of these things. The slave trade had already been banned in the country in 1808. Been done. Like, you cannot ship new slaves into the colonies at all. You have to deal with the existing slaves that are already here. That's the whole idea of the movie. They talk about Amistad. That's because that happened after we banned the slave trade, and then this ship shows up with these slaves, and they have a big deal about, well, what do we do? Do we set them free, or do we keep them here as slaves? But so during this time, you have the abolitionist movement. Now, because they don't have constant flow of slaves coming in through these ports. Now, as far as the good people of the North, they're not seeing the influx of it anymore. So now all they see is just everyday people. People get raised, so then it kind of has that divide. It's kind of like an out of sight, out of mind type deal. So now, as you start having a few free slaves up in the North, or escaped slaves, or whatever, it may soften their heart a little bit. So you got this abolitionist movement going on. Abraham Lincoln, the one thing I'll give to him from learning about him was he was open-minded. He wasn't so open-minded that he necessarily wanted to get rid of slavery, but that comes down to tactics, numbers, because of what's going down. Now remember, the country is expanding, as you mentioned earlier. The country is expanding to these new territories to the west, and we know just off voting and all that other thing, if they allow slavery to be in those areas, as you said, the South will completely dominate politics 100%. So in essence, it's really just it's really a fight over political power. Because the North doesn't want to allow that because they know they're giving up political power because now you have to have representatives over there. They get more votes and they can basically run the gambit with whatever they want to do. And then, as I said earlier, you do have that abolitionist um, movement going on in the background. But at the end of the day, it's all economics. The, you were trying, at that time, they were trying to get rid of a system that for the Southerners, it was very, very profitable. Even now, they always trying to switch the history up on us. Even now, they'll tell you, you hear it now from certain people that, oh, it wasn't even that profitable, blah, blah, to have slaves. Yeah, like tell me what business doesn't have to pay any labor and they're just broke. So you just run a business with no labor expenses and you're just broke. Get out here. And it's a workforce that regenerates on its own because they're having sex, they're having kids. Their kids are now being brought into slaves. And you have that worker guaranteed set for the rest of their life. Until they die, they're your worker. That's free labor. So they want the right because, one, they don't want to do the damn work. And two, if you get rid of the free labor, that means they have to start paying people, which then decreases their profits. So yes, on their principle of wanting the rights, own and maintain the institution of slavery, they separate. The North doesn't go to war to get rid of slavery. Or Lincoln, he goes to war to unite the nation again, not for us to be free. That had nothing to do with us. If you take slavery out the picture, if the South seceded from the Union, that war would have happened anyway, because at the same time, the South was the economic power. That's where all the goods and things were produced for the North to even utilize. The cotton, the sugar, the coffee, all the crops came out of the South. And so they weren't going to let that happen. Even if you took slavery out the picture, it was going to be a civil war over that issue of them seceding from the Union.
So boom, right? The Union beats the Confederacy, and 1865 happens, and slaves are free, and all is right, right?
No, all ain't right.
That's no, right. So we roll into the Reconstruction Era, right? That goes from 1867 to 1877, and we got these things called Black Codes. That's a situation to the president that took over after Abe Lincoln was assassinated, Mr. Andrew Johnson. He felt bad for people. Unfortunately, the people he felt bad for weren't Black people.
Yeah.
He's like, dang, man, all these slave owners lost their property. I need to give back to them. I need to provide them with repayment for their slaves. And they got all of these different types of bills and pay cuts, and kind of like today where we see airline companies getting, bailed out. And that's pretty much what it was. It was bailouts for slavery.
Yes.
And then we transferred into what I said about Black codes, and these were pretty much the Jim Crow before Jim Crow. This was, hey, if you are unemployed and don't have a job, you can get arrested and you can be a slave again. Or if, you get caught loitering, you can get arrested. But loitering was literally just standing on the corner. It was considered loitering. So there was all these laws that they made to say, hey, we are still going to use indentured servants.
Yes, I mean that you started talking now about the 13th Amendment.
Yeah,
the 13th Amendment was the abolition of slavery, except for within the legal system, which is still the case till this day. You got rid of that. You got rid of that free labor. You got to do something. So just like we know they do, they come up with all these other rules so they can still have that. So they can still have that free labor. They use the prison system for it. Like you said, that's where our vagrancy laws come from, the loitering and all that. So they can criminalize a group of people to use them to still accomplish what they were trying to do in the first place. And the laws are so crazy that you could literally be freed from a plantation, get arrested for one of these vagrancy laws, and get sent right back to the plantation that you were freed from. And it wasn't like no prison work program. If they chose you to participate in that, you went to that plantation. That's where you were. It wasn't no go back to the jail. It wasn't no go back to prison. You were there. That's where you live now. That's where you exist now. And now, off of the laws, you are there completely legally now by the laws, the new laws that are being put in place. And you already know the finagling of the system. If they did give you a short time, the plantation owner is going to give you some bullshit that they're going to put on you so they can recharge you again, and you just stay there. And that's the beginning of the beginning of the whole, the police state. As far as the black people are concerned, that's the beginning of the police state. That's also the beginning of, Jim Crow, the beginning times of that. And it's just another way that instead of the country doing what it should have done at the end of the Civil War and the emancipation and all that, what they should have done was legitimately helped establish a group of people so they can become productive citizens. Instead, you targeted that group and used them for the own benefit of the city, state, local government, whatever you want to say. Similar to today, when the police are patrolling poor neighborhoods, giving BS tickets, speeding tickets, arresting people on, stop and frisk laws. Oh, you got possession of marijuana, blah blah. So they can get these minor infractions. Go ahead and let you pay into the legal system. They're getting money. In this case, some of these things, you just pay off the ticket because they know that's what you're going to do. Most people don't want to take the time to fight something like that. So you just pay the money. They're getting money from you that way. Or it's a serious offense, or you're going into the system, and then you're going to end up working on like some IBM computers in prison for like 25 cents an hour, but won't be able to work at IBM once you get out. It's just a continuation. What happens now is the same thing. It's a different version of what was started in the late 19th century. Same thing.
Boom, and you mentioned Jim Crow. That's where we're rolling to next. So the author, the originator of Jim Crow was also coincidentally the originator of what we know today now as blackface, Thomas D. Rice. He did all of the cartoons and the theatrical plays with the big scary black guy chasing the vulnerable white woman, and the guy that's stealing, and then the watermelon faces and all of that. He was big Jim Crow. They used that idea and then they transferred it into saying that we just released these individuals from being slaves. They will never ever be able to co-populate with us whites in society. So even though they are considered technically free, we cannot cohabitate with them. So the Jim Crow, instituted in 1877, went all the way to 1950. And that made it illegal in the majority of southern states for you to be in any public place or any public transportation with white people. It also made it illegal for you to be in an interracial relationship. It also made it illegal, obviously, for you to vote. What many people don't understand is in the Reconstruction era, although there was a lot of negative things, riots and crazy stuff, there were some positive things. Black people started to get places in office. Black people were voting. What a lot of people don't know is because of how profitable slavery was, slaves outnumber white people in the South. So when all those black people became citizens, their vote would easily rule the South. And that was very, very scary to a lot of people. So they come up with Jim Crow. And again, it just pretty much is an addition, adding to the degradation, to the oppression, to the placing people to a bottom subclass, because you got elite, rich white people, you have middle class white people, and then you have poor white people. So how do you sell the mistreatment and the disrespect and all of these things to these black people, to the people that are poor as well? Well, you make them say, well, hey, at least you're not black. That's the selling of it. That's how I can portray, and that's how I can get over on you, and that's how I can make millions off of slavery while you don't make anything, but you're still okay with it. Because that's what it was, to be completely honest. There was a few amount of people profiting off slavery mainly, and there was still a lot of poor white people, but they went along with it because they said, hey, at least I'm not black.
Yeah. That's that whole divide and conquer thing. You know, if you don't want in that kind of situation, especially back in them days, because now you're talking about Reconstruction era. You're talking about, obviously you have the formerly enslaved Americans stomping around, and especially if you get into the Jim Crow era, which is the early 1900s. Due to that loss of that labor, now you see the massive influx of the Italians and the Irish, who themselves had their own level of poverty, their own level of racism they had to deal with in the country. And just like you would normally think, a group of people, like say going through what our people were going through, would naturally meld with, say, like let's say the Irish would naturally meld with them because of the amount of racism and mistreatment they get. But they come to the country as the ruling powers, the elite. You don't want this because that gives them too much power. So you have to create certain things, certain benefits for the Irish people to separate themselves from the black people. There's this book I read a couple of years ago. It's by this white lady, for this Irish American lady, called "What's the Matter with White People." I tell people about this book all the time, and it's a good read. And I always tell them, I was like, I know the book sounds like a crazy title, but it's not really what it sounds like it is. It's really her telling the story of the Irish people here in America, going back to the early 1900s, and how the Irish community was a well-knit community with the black community, and how when they start having the unions come around in the early 1900s, and them not wanting black people to be in the union, but at the time they weren't letting Irish people in the union either. And they used the union membership as a way to separate the Irish from the blacks, start convincing the Irish people that their issues are because of their relationship and closeness to us. They let them into the unions. What do the Irish do? They turn around, turn their back on us. They start considering themselves white, and then there goes that history, that connection. Same with the Italians. As I had this conversation on Facebook with a guy of, he made a comment about, you probably know him. I'm not going to say the name here on this thing, but you probably know this guy, fellow Marine of ours, different unit, but fellow Marine buddy. And he made a comment, was like, about his family being from, his family's essentially from Central America. I'm not going to name the country, but his family's from Central America. And he's talking about how his family is from Central America, the white part of his family from Central America, and blah, 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 and how whites, immigrated here. And I told him, I was like, no white people immigrated to America. He was like, then he gets further into his family history and whatnot. And I'm trying to tell him, like, the white is an American concept. You kind of had to audition for whiteness. Like, people that came over here, Irish, Germans, all these people, they didn't consider themselves white when they got here. They considered themselves Italian, German, Irish, whatever they were. White is what they were applying to be. Once they let go of their ways of thinking and adopted the American ways of thinking, then they considered themselves white. But then, I tossed out to him, because, we're having a conversation on racism, is But if that's the case, why in the world was someone who's from the Central America consider himself white? I was like, if white isn't such a big deal, why would someone do that? I was like, you're Central American or South American, whatever you want to call it. Either way it go, it's not white. I was like, why would someone do that? I was like, there must be some benefit to being able to call yourself white. You know, that goes for the Jews as well. They're Middle Eastern origins, and they claim that. And these are the things that are created by these systems. You know, the idea that certain skin tones are in, certain skin tones are out. Because even during that Reconstruction era, during this Jim Crow time, that's where you start getting into the, you know, even once they start allowing black people to vote with the 3/5 compromise, then you start having the paper bag rule. If you're so dark, if you're, you know, brighter than a paper bag, that means one thing. If you're darker than whatever, you know, you start getting into these crazy rules and these dynamics of skin tone, color, who's in, who's out. And as the migrating peoples to this country, as I said to that guy, I was like, essentially, you know, let's say if we broke it down by races, essentially in this country, which still exists kind of to this day, is you have black people, white people. Your people showed up, black people and white people were having a damn fight. Your people saw that the white people were winning, and y'all jumped on that bandwagon. That's why y'all call yourselves white. That's why, you know, a lot of that Hispanic people call themselves white, Latin descent, Spanish descent, including Mexicans. A lot of them consider themselves white. It's survival. I get it, but this is all an aspect of the things that were started hundreds of years ago that we still buy into to this day. That systems, ideas that we do to this day that people still buy into. That, oh, my skin is better than yours. You know, we see it all the time, especially with these celebrities that want to talk about it. That think they're better than whatever. You know, you get black male celebrities talking trash about certain females and the color of their skin. It's these things are remnants from those time periods. People will just take the time to think about it.
So
I'm rambling a little bit.
After the Jim Crow, there's a civil rights area. I think that's well documented. I think most people got taught that in school.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna kind of speed past that a little bit, and we're gonna go into the late 70s, early 80s. We're gonna talk about Richard Nixon, the first iteration of the getting tougher on crime, how, again, he had to take special interests in conservative voters. And then that went over into Reagan, who took it to the next level, and he greatly funded and portrayed this issue to the American people with the help of the media.
Oh yeah, when you post civil rights era, signing of the Civil Rights Act, I call that time period the Great Okie Doke, because for years you had black people fighting for equality and rights and to be treated equal. And I believe it's our parents' generation. Our parents' generation is the one that got the okie doke, because they were the ones that was kind of like, say, my parents were born prior to the signing of the Civil Rights Act, but they were only a couple years old by the time it was signed. So they're the ones that's coming post Civil Rights Act in a world where we're completely 100% free and can do whatever we want, not realizing the moves that were happening behind the curtain to continually hold us back. And one of those things was the criminalizing the people based on drugs, marijuana. The whole thing with marijuana, that idea started all the way back in the 60s of criminalizing that. I mean, who was that guy? One of Nixon's advisors, I forgot his name. I can never remember anybody's name. But one of Nixon's advisors, let me pull it up. I want to read it. He had a statement, where he essentially admitted that they were targeting targeting black people for the sole purpose of diminishing our power. I can't find it right now, and I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah.
But they literally targeted us by using in the early days. They targeted us by using marijuana as the thing. That's when you start seeing all the propaganda about marijuana makes you crazy, and marijuana makes you do this. And then finally, America bought into it, and they made it illegal. Even though everyone knows there's no negative effects really associated with marijuana, but that's what they did. Now that gets the ball rolling. Now we roll into your boy Reagan, and now we want to get hard on crime, and we start instituting the war on drugs. Let's even go before that. Before the war on drugs in the late 70s, early 80s, you start getting, these backroom deals that the government is doing. And specifically, I'm talking about, the Iran-Contra scandal, where you have certain politicians, congressmen that want to help out a rebellion in South America. So they use drug purchases, money and proceeds. It's a crazy triangle that you have to look into. But they're using the proceeds from drugs and guns to fund that thing. But in the process, they're shipping drugs, cocaine, into America, right into black neighborhoods in the late 70s and into the 80s. And then once your boy Reagan comes in, what do they do now? Oh, drugs is a huge problem in inner city. So then they start the war on drugs. We need to get tough on crime, get tough on these drug dealers. And they start the war on drugs to criminalize us and target us for the thing that they brought into the community. And it amazes me how many black people don't know about the Iran-Contra scandal or the story of Freeway Ricky Ross and all of this, or the Cocaine Cowboys, that documentary that kind of feeds into this as well. And it sounds crazy, but then you have the assistant director of the FBI in the 1991 at a town hall meeting that literally admitted to doing all of this. So the idea of it's just this conspiracy now is proven it's a fact. It's a conspiracy because they conspired to do these things. And people are just oblivious to all of this information. The information is out there, but we just have to, dig down, learn it.
So I got an excerpt from Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. Another book that I highly encourage anybody to read. One of the most fact-based books with references. She's not just shooting from the hip. She is citing every single piece of information that she puts in there. So it is the impact of globalization and deindustrialization was felt most strongly in Black inner city communities, as described by William Julius Wilson in his book, When Work Disappears. The overwhelming majority of African Americans in the 1970s lacked college educations and had attended racially segregated, underfunded schools lacking basic resources. Those residing in ghetto communities were particularly ill-equipped to adapt to the seismic changes taking place in the U.S. economy. They were left isolated and jobless. One study indicates that as late as 1970, more than 70% of all Blacks were working in metropolitan areas held blue-collar jobs. Yet by 1987, when the drug war hit high gear, the industrial employment of Black men had plummeted to 28%. The new manufacturing jobs that opened during the time period were generally located in the suburbs. The growing spatial mismatch of jobs had a profound impact on African Americans trapped in ghettos. A study of urban Black fathers found that only 28% had access to an automobile. The rate fell to 18% for those living in impoverished communities. So what we find is everyone moved to these bigger cities: New York, Detroit, Chicago, Memphis, Cincinnati, for these factory jobs that were highly, highly publicized, highly, highly advertised. Come work for us, come work for the factory, come work at the plant, this and that. Well, all these people moved from the South in droves, right, to go up north and get a good paying job, and then boom, they move. which is crazy because it still happens today. I see it in Detroit all the time. GM hires 200, 300, 400 people, and then boom, they lay off 2,000 the next year. And it's just a recuperating cycle. So then all these poor people are in this community, and then boom, crack cocaine hits. But what we find out when we do more research, we found out, what started to happen is we introduced mandatory minimums. We introduced the media and the whole theme and everything that got pushed by Reagan's wife and how bad crack was and how the basketball player, I don't know if you heard of him, Len Bias, he died in the 80s over a coke overdose, but then it was published in the media that it was crack cocaine. And then it got to the point to where crack was a black drug and it was increasing crime, and the funding for the police departments at the time before Reagan introduced the war on drugs was in the tens of thousands. That year, 1980, I can't quite remember the year, but he took up federal funding for police programs to over $1 million in the 80s. And this was at a time where police primarily were just state and local. We had never before seen this federal influx of policing. Now you're talking about a situation to where now communities are being over-policed disproportionately to who's using the drugs, because at the same time, other people were using drugs too. However, disproportionately, Black communities were being arrested for it, tried for it, given mandatory minimums that were disproportionate to what other people of the same crime were given, so on and so forth. And that period pretty much destroyed all the progress that had been made from 65 to 78.
Yes, I mean, also within that time period, with the institution of the war on drugs, in my opinion, that's kind of like the beginning of the militarization of the police force, because of the amount of money being pushed from the federal government into the police, the tactics they were allowed to use, the new rules they were allowed to operate under, things such as civil forfeiture and all those kind of things. And though, as you said, it just destroyed the community. On top of, as you said, the families that were moving up to the north for these factory jobs, and then those factories turn around and get rid of those jobs because of things like the free trade agreement, which now open up the idea that these companies can go move their jobs overseas, which for them is cheaper labor, which is an increase in profit. Less labor, more profit. And then now you have these communities like, Detroit, where you're from, where you had a large automobile industry that essentially just said, we're out of here. And then now you have, in this time period, you have the influx of crack, the implementation of the war on drugs, the implementation of three strikes law, and then they lose all these jobs, and these people are still here. No jobs, high crime environment, high drug environment, and the opportunities to even better your situation are just, I'm not going to say completely gone, but they're almost completely gone. Your options are severely limited. This idea of, the condition of the Black community is not, as a whole, it's not just a one incident thing. It is a continuation of tactics, ideas, and things that have systematically placed the Black community in the position that it's in. You go back to utilizing bank practices such as redlining and the misappropriating the bank funds, not allowing Black people to own businesses, to even get loans for anything. So you create the redlining, you create the hood, and then within that, once you have now created the hood, then you start defunding public education, which then gets rid of a lot of extracurricular activities. So now the kids don't even have, a lot of them don't even have after school programs or anything they can do to keep them away from doing the wrong thing. So now they're stuck in the street doing all the craziness that they're doing. And then now that they're on the street, now you got the war on drugs going, where now you can mess with them all you want. Then the 90s roll around. If we're talking about specifically the New York area, Northeast, in the 90s they implement stop and frisk. So now you're giving a reason for cops to harass Black and brown people walking around on the street. It's craziness. It's a revolving door that just keeps going around, and every new thing that happens is always, typically, we're always the on the bottom end of that stick, getting the negative impact of that.
So I got two things. I got two things that I want to punch on, that I want to hit on, and then we're gonna punch out. The first is, now that we've went through this long documented history of gut punches and moving the finish line over and over and over again, something that I always hear is, well, such and such made it. All you got to do is try hard. Or we got a Black president. Or look at this person. Why doesn't it matter that certain individuals can see through a filter when the mass majority of people don't?
It doesn't matter. I mean, when you will always, in any situation, any group situation, you'll always have outliers. To mention something like Obama became president, so it's not that bad. That's kind of like almost like anecdotal, because I can say the same thing. I was like, you can have the female. There was a female in the 90s that became the president of Pakistan. Would you say the female and women in Pakistan have equal rights? No, you wouldn't. The success of one individual person is not a reflection on the group as a whole. The same, Madam C.J. Walker was a millionaire in the early 1900s. Would you then say that every Black person in America had the same opportunity, the same situation, that were free to just do whatever they want and become economically independent of white people? No, that is anecdotal. Some things will always work out for the benefit of an individual, but that has no reflection on the state of the majority. The majority will still fall under and go off of the things and be affected by the things put in place to either hold them back or at least be an obstacle that they have to go around. So to me, when you have these things that happen here and there, to me that's the same as saying that's just anecdotal evidence.
I agree. I think justification of the poverty of the masses based on the success of a few is a disrespectful slap in the face. The fact that, yes, we are all American citizens, and we basically, now in 2020, we have pretty much all of the same rights. But unfortunately, my schools don't look like your schools in many of my neighborhoods. My after-school programs don't look like your after-school programs in many of my neighborhoods. The amount of policing is not the same amount of policing in my neighborhoods when studies show that we use controlled substances and drugs at the same rate. When studies show that petty crimes like auto theft and breaking and entering is pretty much at the same rates. However, my neighborhood is policed more. These are all things that, yeah, of course, somebody's gonna make it. Somebody always is gonna make it, but the masses are not, and that's where the issue. So my next thing I want to bring in is, what is this term that so many people keep throwing around that so many other people seem to not really understand? They can't really grasp it cognitively. Maybe it's because it's invisible to them. They can't see it. But what is this systemic racism?
That's a good one. Systemic racism, it is literally saying there is a system of oppression that has been put in place to hold a certain group of people back. Now, obviously, when we talk about the history of America, it's easy to identify systemic racism. It's easy to understand when you can go back and point to things like the shortcomings during the Reconstruction era. You can point to things that were going on during the Jim Crow time period. You can point to black people didn't have the right to vote. All of these things, where it switches is when you start coming into the modern time period, where people have a hard time understanding systemic racism and or systemic oppression and how to identify it. And I generally, when I try to give people an understanding of it, I tell them, I was like, you have to look at when something came into being. Like, say, usually if there's an idea or something that the system is trying to put in place and black people complain about it, if you don't understand why, you should probably research the history behind that thing. So let's say, because an election is coming up, let's talk about voting. And an idea that always comes up around every election cycle is voter IDs. They bring it up all the time. And every time they bring it up, black people are like, no, that's racist, blah, blah, blah. But then a lot of our white buddies, they don't understand, oh, we just want to make sure the elections are safe and everyone's doing the things. And I have to
voter
tell
fraud.
them, I was like, I have to tell them, I was like, the whole idea of doing any of this comes from when we got the right to vote. Voter IDs have existed. The idea of voter IDs have existed since black people got the right to vote. It was instituted as an idea to restrict our vote because at that time there were very few black people that would have been able to even get an ID for that. And so in modern times, because it's just used, it's kind of like it's like a disguised thing. So when people say it, they don't understand that when we hear it with the history connected to it, where they just hear it on the argument of, oh, we just want to make sure our voting is good. Like, no, that's not what it is. That's not ever been the reason for that idea, no matter what they say now. That was never the idea behind it. Similar to gun laws. Like my views of gun laws have changed drastically over the past few years. I used to be almost anti-gun. Then I started learning this history, and then once I realized that there were no gun laws back in the day. You can just have whatever you want, carry it wherever you want, do whatever you want. And then what happened in the 70s? The Black Panthers came around. Black Panthers was heavy into knowing the Constitution. Also, they were heavy into making sure you're armed, know how to use a weapon, ready to protect yourself. What does America do? Starting with California, they institute gun laws. First one, specifically to take guns out of the hands of the Black Panthers and black people. So now, when you're listening to anyone, in my mind, no matter how liberal or whatever they are, they want to restrict the access to it or the possession of it. Now that's all I see. No, that was originally put in place to disarm us.
Yep.
Do not restrict it. You can do other things to make sure it's more safe. Maybe put better standards on people who use them, better classes on people that carry them, but don't restrict them. I'm all about gun rights. Yes, get a gun, hold a gun, protect yourself.
Who's this system? Who's the bad guy? Is it Brad driving the Ford F-150 with the Confederate flag, or is it government officials, or is it the capitalist elite, the big bad billionaires? Who's this system?
I would say this, depending on what aspect of the system we're talking about. If we're talking about just racism in general, it's almost like a living organism in and of itself. That because of the things that were put in place, the rules when they were established, and it's been going on so long with all the propaganda, all the media and stuff that we listen to, it's kind of like just continuing on by itself. Like when, like say you're watching media today, they have the little the doll test that they give kids to, you know, they have a white doll or black doll, which one is the cute one, the pretty one, which one's the ugly one, or they do the one with the pictures, which one is a criminal, which one is the good kid. And it all comes down to, it's always the black one is the ugly one, the black one is the criminal, the white one is the pretty one, the white one is the good guy. You know, that level of psychology, they test this stuff out on like 6 and 7-year-old kids. That stuff they're picking up from media, from TV, radio, news, music. That's where they're picking that up from. That's like I said, it's like a life form that's just continuing to exist on its own. Now, when you start talking about rules and things that are put in place, then you start getting into individuals. When you start going on this, like we're talking about a little bit ago, you start talking about voting, that's people, that's politicians, individual people, and they know what they're trying to do. When they say, let's institute voter IDs, it's a tactic. I mean, just put yourself in anyone's position. Let's take the race thing out of it. Put yourself in someone's position. You want some people to vote for you, but there's a group of people that can really mess that vote up for you. If maybe I can come up with this idea so I can ensure that I win this vote. If you leave the race thing out of it, it doesn't really sound that bad. But when you put the race in there, connected to the history of this country, it's a horrible thing to do, to restrict that vote. And it's when you start getting into that thing, that's when you start getting into individual people. Now, when you start talking about bringing economics into it, now you start talking about the elite 1% and all that. And that starts going within, you know, away from politicians. Now you're going into global powers, global companies that operate on levels and in ways that it's almost impossible to imagine. When you say that it's even, a lot of times it's even impossible to see, because you have to be so informed about the behind the scenes stuff. Like with the rise of, you know, George Bush, the son, George H. Bush, George W., with the rise of George Bush W., you know, with the rise of him and choosing, what's his face? Who's his vice president? I forgot the dude's name already. The son Bush. Shot his homeboy in the face, all that.
Yeah.
Cheney. You know, he signs Cheney in the office. Like, you know, now because of how everything's played out, you know that Bush was not a good candidate for the presidency. He needed Cheney because Cheney had all them connections, but you also know Cheney came from owning that company. So then you don't think about it when you go in, we end up going to war with Iraq, Afghanistan, and then all of a sudden the country is signing all these civilian defense contracts, and they're basically getting no contest contracts handed to the company that Cheney used to work for. That's a level of operation that if you're not fully following a lot of this politics stuff, where people come from, it's hard to spot it. But like I said, when you're talking about the system that's in place, the system in general operates just how it operates. When we're talking about racism in general, it just operates. We're programmed almost to believe these things, and we buy into them unless you put in effort to not buy into them. It's already there. It's already built into the system. But then when you start getting into real moves that need to be made, in my opinion, that's when you start getting into, okay, now who's the one that's putting in this level of oppression? Who's the ones putting in this level of oppression or this messed up stuff that's going on?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it can be pinned on one individual. I don't think it can be pinned on one level of organization. From our standpoint, you know, looking at things, I just feel like, for one, it can't just be solely politics. It can't just be solely the big bad government, because, like I said, you grew up in Memphis, I grew up in Detroit, and they look the same way through several presidents, several mayors, several all these people, whether it was black, white, or indifferent. Detroit still looks the same. So with us, just cancel out that it's just only the government. Let's, you know, it's one of those things to where at the base of it, at the core of it, it's subconsciously in people naturally.
Yes.
To familiarize with who you are familiar with culturally.
Yeah,
and
tribalism, basically.
As advanced as we are as a nation, and as diverse as we are as a nation, there are still millions, droves of people who grow up never even seeing a black person, depending on where you live at in America.
Yeah.
So now you grow up and you are not even familiar with black people. You are make your way for whatever, your journey, and you become an executive manager at a huge bank or real estate corporation, and you start to see names run across that you can't pronounce and are unfamiliar to you, you automatically dismiss them and you go with what's more comfortable, and it's subconscious. In your mind, it's not because you dislike black people. Sometimes it is, but more likely it's not. But subconsciously, you go with what's more comfortable. Same thing with politics. In your mind, you go with what is more comfortable for you and how you grew up. If you grew up in rural Georgia, you are not concerned with what's going on urban Chicago. All you know about urban Chicago is that you see on the news that 187 people died from gun violence in 2 months. That's all you know about Chicago. So liberal politics and gun laws must be horrible.
Yes. No, I mean, when you're talking about, and see, we get into this conversation when you're talking about bringing in politics and all that. Like, there's too much. This whole idea of, like we were talking about before, going back a little bit, it's all tribalism. Any people will try to group with like-minded people. But if you start putting certain groups of people that now physically look different, then they will group together based on that. At the end of the day, if we say not racism, but we say prejudice, bigotry, it all extends from that. It's a form of tribalism. Any group of people will start viewing things about another group of people because a group of people will have their own ideas, morals, things that they live by. And then if there's another group of people that in any way go against that's different from that, you'll separate yourself from, we are like this, they are like that. And that is prejudice, bigotry in and of itself on a small scale. When you start going to sizes of cities and sizes of countries, then that's when you start getting in racism, because now you have to start making up rules that now can become laws. And then now if you have within that city or that society, now you have different groups. The group that's in power is going to be the ones that make the rules to say this is what we're going to do. And if they don't like that group and they don't want them in, they're going to start putting rules against them, kind of like America. They didn't want us to be a part of a lot of the stuff that was going on, so they put certain rules in place, certain practices in place that still we still feel the effects of till this day. With the idea of white privilege that's going around, a lot of white people don't understand it. They think just because you say there's white privilege, that's supposed to mean somehow their life is automatically better than ours or should be better. They don't understand that all that means is there's certain aspects of society that you don't have to worry about, that is not even a concern to you. Like, for the most white people, you don't have to worry about going to a store and literally being followed around the store as if you're going to steal something. It's not something you have to worry about. It's not. That's a part of, for a lot of black people, that's a part of any time they go anywhere. Like, you're going to be followed. You're not worried. You don't have to worry about when you walk into a store, you're automatically considered a suspect. Period. You don't have to worry of the fact that the idea of all black people look the same, and you might get stopped by a cop because in his mind you look like somebody familiar. Kind of like with that video on Facebook from a couple of days ago, where then two cops rolled up on that black guy, and it turned out that black dude was an FBI agent because, oh, you look like this guy, and they immediately treat him. Forget the idea that we say we live by of everyone's innocent until proven guilty. They just immediately treat him like he's guilty. We're going to arrest you, and just go through with it. And they find out he's an FBI agent, and then they want to get all apologetic, be nice, and whatnot. This thing that we have in this country, it's so ingrained, racism. It's so ingrained, and part of it, like I said, is everyone has it in their own way. a form of prejudice, a form of bigotry. But in order to combat those things, you have to get to know those people. Like my last what I want to say, probably like my last 3 years in the Marine Corps, I was an equal opportunity representative. And I used to say this to people all the time whenever I had to do any of my training for equal opportunity. I used to tell them all the time, when you walk around, you have to view yourself as an ambassador to your group of people, because you never know what anyone's interaction is with someone from your group, if they ever had interaction with someone from your group at all. So you have to treat it that way, because in order to stop these things and really get rid of it, you have to get to know the people that you're in contact with. To really understand Mexicans, you have to talk to Mexicans. You have to understand what they consider their history, their experience within America. You have to talk to, if it's pretty hard to come across Native Americans, but if you are around any, I think in my entire time in the Marine Corps, I only met one Native American. But you talk to them, learn their story, their history, what they went through, how they view things. And in learning that, that's what opens your mind up to that experience. If you're living your life coming in contact with a race of people, any other group of people, and then you end up not knowing nothing about that group of people, you weren't trying. It's like I used to say a lot of times when I was doing those discrimination training in the Marine Corps was, I used to always say, Black people living in America is kind of like we're the stepchild living in the house with white people. And we've grown up all this time. In this time period, for our own survival, we've had to understand white people. But then we end up, both of us, we grow up and move out of this house. We basically know everything about you, and you don't know nothing about us. And white people in general should have a problem with that, because we've been here the entire time that y'all have been in this country. We've been here. We've contributed, in my opinion, we've contributed more to this country than any other race. The foundation of America is our blood, is our ancestors for the foundation of this country. It became an economic powerhouse due to the free labor afforded to them by the Africans. And it's wild that in today's world that we can have, some of them are buddies that we've known for years through the Marine Corps. And, in a time like this, don't have a slightest bit of understanding when you say, hey, this is messed up. Somebody should not take a knee on someone's neck for 8 minutes until they pass out. All they can say is stuff like, oh, well, he's a criminal. Why are you making him a martyr? We're not making him a martyr. It doesn't matter if his rap sheet was 3 miles long. The problem is just because the rap sheet's long doesn't give someone the right to take a knee on somebody's neck until they die. That's not worth a death penalty. So when I hear that, it's kind of like someone arguing to me like you're justifying, because he's a criminal, possibly, you're saying it's okay to kill him. Oh, okay. So because Ahmaud Arbery, because he walked in that house, he deserved to get shot. Because Eric Garner was selling them cigarettes, he deserved to get choked out. You're literally saying these things are, every time white people justify these things, it's like you're literally saying whatever infraction that person did, that was worth the death penalty. Selling CDs? Yeah, you gotta die. You can't just be selling CDs, man.
Because me as a human being, I rate it, and you've already used this phrase, but I rate to have that cognitive dissonance because it does not immediately affect me. It is not immediately an emergency to me. I'll change the direction of it to give another example of it, but a lot of men, Black, white, Latino, Chinese, blah, whatever you want to, whoever, are dismissive to the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
Because it's not an emergency. It is not something that, as a man, I necessarily fear. I didn't get sexually assaulted by my boss, by whoever.
Yeah.
I don't care. So it's one of those things to where in my heart, I'm not racist. I don't hate black people, but at the same time, I'm not just about to sit here and spend my entire day and all my time talking about why black people shouldn't be treated bad. That ain't got nothing to do with me. That's their fight. It's the same thing as a dude that was walking down the side of the road because his car broke down. That don't got nothing to do with me. That's what I feel like. I feel like the 77% of this population are driving past us hitchhikers with our thumb out on the side of the road saying, that's got nothing, I got nothing against you personally, but that's got nothing to do with me.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up the Me Too movement. Like we're saying, every group of people have their things, and if you don't interact with that group of people, you'll never understand. Like even when like I told you, I was the EO representative for my last few years. It wasn't until that where I even understood the female point of view on a lot of things, and I forgot it was a female Marine. I know you know her. You partied with her a few times. But she's the one that kind of got me to understand. And if it wasn't for her, and it's the same, I had homosexual friends, females. I don't think I knew any homosexual males when I was in the Marine Corps, but definitely, lesbian females are all over the Marine Corps. But it was talking to them. I get to hear their stories about homosexual because, you have messed up views about any group of people if you don't really come in contact with them. And, you get to ask them because they're your friends and it's the Marine Corps. You get to ask them all those messed up questions that may be considered, if I'm talking about that, may be considered homophobic. Or, any of our white friends, you may have questions that may be considered racist, but you have to ask the question, have to have the conversation. None of these issues go away if we don't have the conversation. The Me Too movement, all of it. If it wasn't for the Me Too movement, everything they used to talk about, I was like, ain't no way. Ain't no way people is doing this to females. I understand females get raped, but ain't no way. And then Harvey Weinstein happens, and Jeffrey Epstein, and Bill Cosby, and then all these other ones start coming out the woodwork. You're like, oh damn, dudes is really out here doing this stuff. Louis C.K. Who else? People are really out here doing this stuff, and it's just one of those things. Is like you said, it doesn't affect you, so. It doesn't affect you, so you don't think about it. It's not because it don't affect you, you don't think about it. But then when it comes to certain situations, some topics, you just can't even comprehend it.
Right.
Like I said, like we know people rape people. Dudes rape females, dudes rape each other, whoever. People rape people.
Facts.
But for it to become predatory on that level, that's just something, maybe because I've never had that kind of power and influence over any female. Right. That is just something I could never even imagine happening, that someone would do that on that level. I can imagine a powerful person taking advantage of a female or two females, but on the level that these guys were doing it on is just crazy. Yeah, I mean, we're kind of going off the subject of what we're originally talking about, but All
right, man, we'll wrap it up, and till next time. Good talk, bro.
All right, man. I'll see you.